Hello, welcome to another episode of Lessons from a Podcaster. Today, here with me, I have Kay Miller. Kay, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start right away with our pitch challenge. So, in 30 seconds, if you meet someone in the elevator and they ask you about your podcast, what do you say?
Well, Uncopyable Women in Sales is for any sales professional who wants to make more sales. I interview successful sales professionals and everything between sales and CEOs so that they can give their background, exactly how they became successful, and provide advice and specific action steps for the listener.
Perfect.
Great was that pitch. 30 seconds?
I think it was even a little bit less.
Good. Really I talked fast.
Yeah, really nice. And why did you start this podcast? Do you remember your first episode and the reasons behind starting this project?
Well, as I mentioned, I started out in a male-dominated industry. Mm-hmm. I became the number one salesperson. And I wanted, because I didn't feel a ton of support from the other women, I always vowed that I would help other women. So fast forward to now, I have a business with my husband, and he wrote a number one bestseller, and it's called Uncopyable. It's on branding, innovation, and marketing. And the publisher, knowing that I have an unusual and very successful sales background, asked if I would write a book on sales where I applied that framework to sales specifically. And so I wrote the book, and then I wanted to take it a step further and share not only my expertise, but the expertise of other women from all industries all over the world, to find out what their advice would be to other women who want to skyrocket their sales.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you have both a book and a podcast, because it allows me to ask you, what do you think is the difference from as an author or content creator, you want to share a message and transmit ideas and your thoughts. And I guess, of course, writing and speaking, there are different ways of transmitting an idea. So in your experience, since you have both a book and a podcast, what are the biggest difference in terms of actually transmitting a message if you compare your book and the podcast?
Well, the book has certain concepts, and of course, everything that I, talk about is being uncopyable. So, for example, in the book, we call your ideal target market your moose. We talk about branding colors. We talk about stories that you have that make you uncopyable and memorable. So I have a framework that someone can follow to make more sales. Now, before I interview a guest, I always send them a book. And some of these people are my moose. And so some of them have promoted my book on the podcast. Some of them have purchased the book. And some of them are leading trainings on the book, all because of this podcast. So it's been sharing other information that has really been inspiring for me. And I've learned a lot, and it's promoted my book, and I'm also interested in speaking, and it's also promoted my speaking. The podcast, of course, the information is coming from other women who have different experiences. And so again, my book is about me, mostly all about me. And the podcast is all about the women I interview.
Oh, okay. That's nice. So it gives you also a framework for you to speak with others, share the perspective of other women, and as well, I guess, for you to expand your network, right? Which
exactly.
The book is very one-sided, right? You just write it and you don't communicate with your readers, right? Whereas with the podcast, you communicate with the people that with your guests, right?
Right. And as I said, not everyone has talked about the book or promoted the book, but some of the women who have read the book first have just raved about the book, talked about, using the same verbiage that I use about moose and stories and being memorable. and creating an uncopyable brand. So they are tying those concepts into the podcast. But you're right. I'm getting their feedback, their perspective on how this ties into their sales experience. It's been really fun, very inspiring. I've learned things. I just actually had a young woman, Gen Z. I'm a boomer. And she came on and talked about specific AI tools, a whole list of tools. Some I'd never heard of. Some she said are brand new on the market. So it's interesting that I'm learning a lot and I can share that with my listeners too.
Yeah. And how many episodes do you do per month?
I do one a week, and this is a
Once a
fairly
week,
new
okay.
podcast. I started in September.
Okay.
So far it's growing consistently. One of the things that I'm doing to promote and grow the podcast is I've gotten connected with more women's groups, women in sales, and some of the women that I've interviewed were kind of pie in the sky. I didn't even expect them to say yes, but they did. It's been really fun. One story that's kind of funny is that the second episode of my podcast, I approached Kara Golden, who is the founder of a company called Hint Water. And it's now worth $220 million.
Wow.
This water is available in Target and Costco and Whole Foods. And so I never expected her to say yes, but she did. I approached her on LinkedIn, and it was really an awesome interview. But a funny story is that being number 2 on my list of podcasts I'd done, I was horrible. I was like a robot. And I, looking back, it's kind of embarrassing, but that is one huge piece of advice I would give any podcaster who's new or starting out with a podcast. Practice makes perfect. I'm 30 episodes in now, which still isn't a huge amount, but I can see a real difference between how I started and how I'm doing the interviews now. So stick with it would be one piece of advice.
And as well, don't be afraid to do this kind of moonshots, right? Because even if someone you think it's too big to accept to being on your podcast, it can work, right? And often they do accept because they want the exposure and they want to meet other people in their network. Now, I'm curious to understand how you use these networking groups to also grow your show. So first of all, how do you find these groups? Where are they? Like, are they like on Facebook or on a specific, like LinkedIn? Are they actual in real life? And then how do you promote your podcast there without kind of sounding too spammy?
Well, most of the women's groups are on LinkedIn. And if you ask me what they're called, I probably won't be able to recall what they are. But I've also promoted through my guests. So that has been really big. And just putting the word out there. I've been involved in an association called the National Speakers Association, and everyone there has huge networks. So that's been one way that I've done that. You had one other question, which I can't remember.
The question is how do you actually speak about your podcast? Because sometimes if you join one of these groups, you don't want to be that person that'll be like, hey, here's a link for my new episode. Here's another link for my next episode. So how do you get them to actually speak about it without sounding too spammy?
Well, one thing I've done, because I have a really interesting background, a very successful background, I have been on a ton of other podcasts. So I actually hired a VA to find podcasts that fit my niche. And so whenever I'm on their podcasts, they've been very kind in promoting my podcasts. I do reach out on LinkedIn, but I usually offer them a book. And that's a huge advantage, obviously, that I have a book. It's always better to offer something. I've even had people approach me and they say, hey, I've read your book. Well, they have it all over someone who just spams me. So I look for a connection. I actually ask other women if I can be a guest on their podcast. And again, I'm in sales, so I
Mm.
believe that nothing will happen unless you ask. You
Yeah.
might hear no 90% of the time, but if you hear yes 10% of the time, you can really land some guests
Mm.
that have huge networks. And Kara Golden, for example, she then turned around and asked if she could replay my podcast to her network. And she has a huge
Wow.
network. So that was, again, a big win. So
Mm.
those are some of the ways, again, since I'm part of this National Speakers Association, anybody who has a book or a product to promote, it will be very motivated to be on your podcast. If you
Mm.
tell them, hey, I want to help you spread the word about your book. And when I'm podcasting, when I'm interviewing a guest, I really want to make them look good, make them look like a superstar. I really try not to make it about me. I have sent a book ahead. I always say I'd appreciate if you mention it, but this is mainly going to be about promoting you.
Mm.
So
And
if
this
I
is when
have
they
that
go to your
attitude,
show, right?
what's
When they
that?
go to your that happens when they go to your show, right? So you send a book ahead to your future guests. Is that it?
I always send a book to my future guests, but I also send books as a first step to a guest that I want. I'm
Mm.
sending you a book. I'm sending you a gift. I'd love to be on your podcast. Again, I did have a VA that was getting me bookings on other podcasts, but now I can go back and say, okay, I've got something
Mm.
new. And a
Hmm.
lot of those are open to
Understand.
that as well.
I'm also curious about having a VA because there are some tools out there, some websites. I think there's one called Podmatch or Match. I don't recall the name, but something that allows you, some tools that allow you to actually match with other potential podcasts that where you can be a guest. Why using a VA instead of actually using one of these tools?
Well, a VA saves me time. So she
Mm.
can go through, she not only finds them, but she vets them. As I said, I'm getting a lot of inquiries now to be on my podcast, but they're not all a fit. So that's why I use a VA. I just did an episode. It's episode 29, and that's when I interviewed this VA. And she gave a ton of specific tools on finding your ideal guest and or customer, your moose, and then also getting information on them so that you can reach out in a way that you're offering content or offering
Mm.
something.
Okay. Speaking about tools, I'm curious about what tools do you use in your production. So, from idea to publish, what are your favorite tools for podcasting?
Well, I have to look at my list. But again, my guests are coming from referrals as well.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, most of my referrals are coming from men who want to support this. And so far, I've got a huge queue still of
Mm-hmm.
people that I can interview who have come from the men in my network. Customers, we have a big list of customers that we have worked with or potential customers for our consulting business. So from the beginning, it's deciding what kind of guest I want to
Mm-hmm.
have on the podcast. And I'm going to say I use Zoom to record. I put these through Descript. I do my own editing at this point through ScreenFlow. I often use AI, even with PodSqueeze, which I'll get to in a minute. Or I just mention it now that PodSqueeze offers a ton of tools to post on social media, to send to my list. The transcript is great, but I can put that into ChatGPT and say, summarize this in 250 words or 500 words, whatever I want. Then there's a tool called Opus that you can put clips on
Mm-hmm.
YouTube. It breaks them down into shorts, which is huge. And of course, I mentioned my VA, and I have a Blue Yeti mic. So those are the things I could think of at this point.
What do you use the script for? So normally the script is known as a tool as well to edit, but
Yes.
you don't use the script to edit, or do you?
Yes, I do. I use it to
Okay.
edit. So after I record a Zoom, I always put it in Descript. Descript will automatically find every and every I say all the time, and I sometimes I want to get a gun and shoot myself. I say it so often, so you can just automatically remove all those words. I just had a guest that had a profanity twice, and my podcast is rated clean. So with
Okay.
Descript, I could edit that out. And Descript, for those who don't know, you edit it like a Word doc and it automatically edits the video. So
Hmm.
if there's a section that you don't want, I try to record it as if it was a live interview, but if there's a big gaffe or a long space, I do use Descript to pull that all
Hmm.
together. I also
Okay.
use Descript to put it into studio sound. And if my guest does not have a good mic, it can sound tinny and just horrible quality. And when I run it through Descript, it will apply studio sound to the whole entire interview, and it sounds very professional. So that's
Okay.
what I use Descript
Interesting.
for.
You just mentioned the profanity, the guest using profanity, and that's actually something that I've never mentioned here in the podcast, which is how do you react? So if you are rated clean, you don't want profanity in your show. Do you mention that before actually starting the show, the interview? Do you mention if the guest uses a curse word? Like, how do you tell your guests that they should not, say profanity
I've
in the show?
never had that happen. So I do not tell a guest not to use profanity,
Right.
and nobody ever has. What this guest said wasn't horrible, but I just simply took it out with Descript. So it
Okay.
was
So
very
it's not a
easy.
big
And
deal.
yeah, for me, it's no big deal. But I have a book on podcasting, how to monetize podcasting,
Mm.
and I emailed him. He was kind enough to respond, and I said, is this a profanity that would jeopardize my clean rating? And he said, if you have to ask, then you should take it out.
Yeah.
And with Descript, it was so easy. I thought, I hope it doesn't disturb the flow. And it really didn't. It was fine. So I don't know, because out of 30 interviews, this has happened
Mhm.
once. I think most people will assume that. Now, if this happens more, I will mention it, but it hasn't been an issue. And I just don't picture most of my guests saying that.
Okay. Yeah. As a last question for you, and since you have so much experience as well with sales and women in sales, um, I'm curious, what advice would you give to a woman that is now starting into the business and specifically the sales world, sales industry, that would help her somehow manage and navigate through those waters?
I have an excellent piece of advice, and that is to listen to my podcast, Uncopyable Women in Sales. So that really, there is so much information that's coming out. But I'd say rejection is part of sales. You have to steel yourself. The only way that you get through fear and rejection is doing it. Nike nailed it when they said, just do it. There is just
Mhm.
no magic way of getting through it. So expect rejection. Don't be afraid to ask. Like I asked Kara Golden if she would be on my podcast. You'll never get a yes unless you ask. And so that's another one. Also, you need to stand out from every other salesperson out there. Everything I do is the goal is to be uncopyable. That means being memorable. Whether you have a story, whether you have a brand promise, I cover all this in my book, which is Uncopyable Sales Secrets. So that's another recommendation, not to promote myself too much, but those are some of the really important parts: to separate yourself, and of course, building a trustworthy relationship. Unless you have a one and done sale, you have to build trust by going back to the basics, doing what you said you'll do, telling the truth. Even if something goes wrong in the sale, it's always horrible to deliver bad news, but your customer will trust you if you do that. So those are a few of my sales gems, but so
And
many of
really
these
good
are
ones.
covered in
Yeah.
my book and podcast.
Mhm. Okay, these I think were really interesting and valuable insights. And it was a pleasure to have you here in the podcast, Lessons from a Podcaster. Where can we find you? Can you say again the name of your podcast and your socials and where people can find you?
I'll just mention a few that the podcast is Uncopyable Women in Sales. I do have a lot of male listeners too, so it's got great advice. You can search for it on any platform. My book is called Uncopyable Sales Secrets. It's on Amazon. LinkedIn is the biggest social platform that I use, and my LinkedIn is Miller K. So Miller, K-A-Y spelled out. And last but not least, you can email me, k@uncopyablesales.com.
Perfect. I will link everything in the show notes of this episode. Okay, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by PodSqueeze, an essential tool for podcasters that creates show notes, timestamps, clips, and more. Visit podsqueeze.com and use the code PODCASTER for 20% discount in the first 3 months. We release a new episode every Tuesday and Thursday. See you in the next episode of Lessons from a Podcaster.